Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucas Mendes. I'm the founder and CEO at Revelo. I'm going to be moderating the discussion today with some amazing engineering leaders. It looks like there's a few people joining already. Let's get started. Once again, welcome to our webinar, From Hype to Reality, Leveraging AI to Boost Engineering Productivity. I'm Lucas Mendes. I'm the founder and CEO at Revelo. And today we're joined by three amazing engineering leaders who are going to share how their teams are leveraging AI tools like Copilots and LLMs and how that's changing the way they think not only about software development, but also about managing engineering teams. I'll start by making a quick intro here for everyone. First, we've got Sakshi Garg. She's head of engineering at Hydrolix. Thanks, Sakshi. Thanks for joining us. We also have Ryan Cooley, Director of Engineering at ProcessMaker. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for being here with us. And Anant Gupta, SVP of Engineering and Data Science at Included Health. All right, so pretty strong lineup of engineering leaders here. And I'm going to start the discussion talking a little bit about current use cases of AI and AI tools within your software engineering workflows and team management workflows. So I want to start by taking the pulse, the three of you, and ask from each of you, well, AI tools like GitHub Copilot and Tab9, they're all the buzz right now. But from your experience, how are these tools actually changing the day-to-day for your engineers? Are they really as game-changing as they seem? And we'll probably start with Ryan.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So in terms of our current experience with these tools, we do have some metrics on that. About half of our engineers are using Cursor, which is the tool that we've decided to adopt. Obviously, this market is changing so quickly. We want to be open to trying out other tools, and we do have some other pilots planned. But right now, about half of our engineers are using that tool. Cursor is essentially a fork of VS Code that has a lot of extra AI features built into it. The metrics that we have show that the tab completions recommended by Cursor are usually accepted around 25% of the time, which means the completions that the AI suggests are helpful around 25% of the time. We're not prescriptive, though, about what people use internally. So if people want to use a different IDE or they want to try out a different AI tool, then they're certainly more than welcome to do so. We're not collecting metrics on all of that. So it's possible that more of our engineers are using these tools. We do think that most of our engineers are using chatbots, ChatGPT, Claude, things like that to kind of help troubleshoot in general. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of our adoption.
All right. Sakshi, would love to hear from you.
So in terms of AI tool adoption, I think we're still kind of in the phase of trying and experimenting things out. We are running a pilot with Copilot at the moment. We are trying to see what kind of attention we get from the engineers there. I think for the most part on the engineering teams, people are using ChatGPT. They're probably using a free version of these tools, and we're trying to make it more centralized across the organization. We are using Gemini as well. That's more for taking meeting notes, helping summarize them, helping circulate them. So that's kind of the usage right now.
Okay. Finally, Anant.
Yeah, we actually use quite a bit of AI internally here at Included, largely because I think it's just been one, because it enables us to experiment and build better products for our users, but also allows us to move more effectively. We're using Copilot, we're using Gemini, and actually we built a platform internally as well. So a lot of the stuff we're doing stays within our ecosystem, leveraging these technologies behind the scenes. To answer your question, like I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of what even game-changing means, because there's a part of me that's like, holy crap, like there's a thing that can write code for you and like can write documentation, test cases. I wish I had this like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And like from that angle, it feels game-changing. On the other hand, you also have like Zuckerberg going on the Joe Rogan podcast and talking about how they expect to use AI to replace a mid-level engineer by the end of this year. Like that feels like a little bit of a stretch. I think a lot about this in the context of tech, which as tech leaders, we tend to be we are over ambitious at times, and it feels in that regard. But internally, we've actually seen quite similar to what the data Ryan was sharing. Like for the folks who do use it, we see pretty significant productivity gains. Now, it also just depends on the type of work, like your grunt work, your boilerplate code and things like that. For more sophisticated, more complicated things, it then depends more on the user. Like how effectively are they able to use it? How effectively are they able to augment it into their development lifecycle? I think this is going to change anyway. I think of the AI phase very much like how companies were talking about the future of mobile about 15 years ago or something like that. Like, I personally am of the opinion, try and experiment with it. It's going to be the norm. AI is changing so much that in the next 6-12 months, if you have that practice and that habit built on top of it, I think we're going to be much faster, much further ahead.
That's a great take on it. I want to double click on some of the typical use cases we've been hearing most about. I mean, testing, debugging, and sometimes code reviews. Testing, let's start with testing maybe. It's always been a bottleneck. Have you seen AI tools improve test automation, or have you measured improvements in test coverage in your teams with the use of AI tools?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think AI can be really helpful in writing like unit tests, automated tests for you. That's super beneficial. Now, it depends how good the code you wrote in the first place was, but I think it'll prevent future issues or breakages rather than find existing bugs, though you can use it for that. The challenge I think that shows up though with testing generally is it's more so the integration of the systems. It's the, hey, a member or a user is using the product, something doesn't work, and it's like 8 levels deep. And they are usually in this like edge case or they have some data and stuff like that. I don't think we've made enough progress there. Like in a future world, I imagine something to be able to say is like, hey, test the system for these 8 different types of variants of users, like build it for a power user, a weak user, or a first time user and stuff like that. I think that's where we haven't. Like, I think you could do this with like more synthetic data and like how you use AI to generate that data for you. But that's where I think is the next stage. So the way I think about this is I think in a future world, what will happen is you'll need tools that integrate AI. So AI by itself is a technology that's going to solve some parts of it, but you need better tooling and better products that sort of leverage that. And then I think the larger you get, you may build more custom in-house stuff. So I would not be surprised for companies like Google, Facebook, or what have you, who have built up a lot of these things. For most of early stage companies, there's going to be companies that will come in and do that for you. So I think for us, we are seeing some increase, like automation, unit tests, things like that. But for broader integration tests, I think there's still more work to be done.
Ryan, how do you approach incorporating AI tools into testing?
Yeah, so we actually, early on in the early era when OpenAI had just released their API, we asked one of our engineers, I think he's actually on the call today, we asked one of our engineers to help us build a tool that would write Cypress tests. We use Cypress primarily for our end-to-end tests, to write Cypress tests based on manual test cases. So we have our QA department, which had been largely focused on manual test cases, and we've been undergoing this transition where we're trying to move them more and more toward automation. And so we put together this tool that takes those manual test cases that they've written and converts them into Cypress tests. And it uses a vector database to increase the context window of the large language model to make sure that it has access to our full test suite. We've seen some success with that. In practice, it's been a little bit limited because it doesn't necessarily pick up all of those edge cases that we'd like it to pick up. And it does require a lot of handholding because it doesn't really have the full context of how our application actually works. So it can kind of get our QA engineers maybe 25% of the way there, but then they have to carry the rest through the other 75% to completion. So for boilerplate, as was said, and things like that, it's very helpful. But in terms of increasing our overall test coverage.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit about documentation. That seems to be a low-hanging fruit for the use of AI. And Sakshi, I want to hear from you. Documentation often gets deprioritized, but it's so critical. Are you seeing AI step up in automating things like API documentations, technical guides? And that's one question. And two, is the output actually usable?
So we heavily rely on manual documentation at the moment. We have document writers that are helping us with internal and external documentation. I think the area where AI helps is collating notes and discussions that are happening in different meetings with the transcriptions and making them more intelligent, and then using those sort of high-level notes and being able to make our documentation more knowledgeable and more detailed around it. But it's not like AI is replacing the need of document writers at the moment. We still have a lot of manual documentation going.
Got it. Anant, what's your take on that?
Yeah, we're on the opposite end of it because we don't have internal in-house document writers and things like that. So for us, AI is better than anything out there. Like, I mean, I guess you can ask engineers and teams to do it, but I think from that angle, it's super helpful. The part that actually is interesting, the documentation, is not the first. It's the keeping up the documentation. Like, do you make sure that it stays up to date? That's the thing I don't think we've fully nailed. Like, I think what you'll have is you'll have great documentation on code. You'll have great documentation in terms of like commenting, things like that. And you can also just say, hey, write me a doc based on this. It is the subsequent changes. So I make a change, I add a new feature functionality. How do I go back and update Confluence? And so again, I feel like by the way, my solution to all problems is not tooling, but it sometimes feels like, how do you integrate these things together? Because up until now, software development has worked in sort of silos. You code in an IDE, you deploy in a cloud container, and you have documentation in Confluence or whatever else wiki you use. These are three disparate systems that don't talk to each other. That needs to change. And I think that will change. In the past, there was not enough value for these things to fully integrate because there was not a through line. But things like documentation, testing, product discovery, product build, I think then you start tying it together. There's a future world where a product person or a product manager or a designer says, hey, here's what I need to build. That generates code for you, generates tests for you, generates documentation for you, and even gets deployed. And maybe engineer doesn't even do anything. Like, imagine a world where someone just presses a button and it gets deployed. Those are the integrations that need to happen. In the absence of that, I think you're going to get piecemeal solutions, which is an engineer might say, hey, I need to document this code, ask whatever tools, if you either built it in-house or not, it will generate it for you. But that's sort of the world I think we're going to get toward.
Yeah, in that world, somebody still has to press the button for it to happen, right? And in your world where everything's integrated, you probably need context windows and token windows that we're just not there yet, right? All right, let's talk about debugging for a little bit. And it's one of those tasks that no one loves. Everyone has to do. Then my sheriff looking for missing columns. How is AI helping your engineers diagnose and resolve bugs more quickly? I'll start with Ryan.
Yeah, so I think the way I look at it is LLMs, especially chatbots, can kind of serve as like the ultimate rubber duck for debugging. You have this rubber duck debugging concept where sometimes speaking a problem out loud will help an engineer to better understand it and will maybe lead to some type of revelation on how they can fix an issue. And so in this case, you have a rubber duck that talks back to you and that can actually understand what you're dealing with, right? The problem is, as you alluded to, that we don't have large enough context windows necessarily to make that as valuable as it could be. But that's where we see things like embeddings and vector databases come in handy, because you can essentially give the AI access to the entire code base to kind of help you there. I would say that ChatGPT has taken the place of tools like Stack Overflow. Even documentation that is written by frameworks that you might use or things like that can be kind of queried by these bot tools. So that makes it a little bit easier to interrogate the documentation of some of these frameworks that you might be using and to get information that you might not otherwise be able to get.
Okay, thank you. I want to change gears here a little bit and talk about challenges and best practices for AI adoption. I think that varies tremendously from one organization to another. So it'd be great to get different points of view here. I'll stay with you, Ryan, for this one. The title of the podcast, the title of the webinar is From Hype to Reality. And it's really easy to get caught up in the hype, especially if you're a non-technical person reading news about how AI is going to change the way software is produced. How do you balance in reality the power of AI while making sense that making sure that the people, the engineers, still rely on their judgment and critical thinking to produce their best work?
Sure. This is the state of the world now, but 6 months down the road, 12 months down the road, we could see big leaps in this technology and how it works. This is a really big question, obviously not just in engineering, but in every field where AI can be useful. We're seeing it across many different industries. We recently had to ask this question when we were putting together a code test for new hire candidates. Do we adapt this code test for a more modern framework? Do we encourage even the use of AI in these code tests or not? And in the end, we settled on encouraging things like using ChatGPT along with more traditional resources like Stack Overflow, because we realized that engineers will always use these tools in real life debugging, right? So we wanted to give the candidates a fair shake at doing that. But we did discourage the use of things like Copilot, which we think gave us maybe a good balance in terms of finding out what the engineer's skill set actually is. We didn't want to see AI generated code necessarily. We wanted to see what the engineer could write by hand. But this was a lot of back and forth. This was a debate that we had internally for a little while before we settled on it. I think the biggest thing is our engineers have domain expertise, right? And they know the application that we're building inside and out, whereas the AI does not. And so that is one thing that will keep them engaged for sure, is just the complexity of modern applications. AI currently can't wrap its head around the full complexity of an application, whereas our engineers can. So we think that our engineers will continue, hopefully, to be fully engaged and have to employ critical thinking in that regard.
Great. Sakshi, I want to hear your take on that. How do you make sure that engineers still rely on their judgment while making use of AI tools?
So we were strongly discouraging use of any AI tools until very recently. Our concerns were stemming from the fact we don't fully understand how the data is being used for training and other purposes, and what kind of legal implications it would open us up to. So I think we were still kind of analyzing a lot of those questions internally, figuring out if that is the right path for the engineering organization to be going on. Until very recently, like I mentioned, we were not even using Copilot. We recently started running an internal pilot, and here we've kind of identified a few engineers who are going to be the early adopters in the organization. They're going to figure out usage of Copilot, how we can use it, if it's actually enhancing productivity, if it's helping us write reliable code. I think then we'll probably be on the whole AI bandwagon. But yeah, we are being a bit more conservative in that sense at the moment.
As I mentioned, that it really varies from organization to organization. How about you, Anant, at Included?
Yeah, so we've actually established partnerships with all these companies and where we maintain data ownership and things like that. And so we've been using these systems for the last year and a half almost. Now, I think the question that you asked about judgment is a real one. My fear sometimes is, does the engineer know that the code that they're shipping, do they themselves understand it? Or did AI solve this problem for them in a super smart, clever way? And you are working through this. So that's why we're still having people do code reviews. So the human code review element doesn't go away. I actually don't know the right answer here. What if the code reviewer is also what I did is I just piped this into our internal AI system and that said this code looks great, and next thing you know, it gets shipped. And so I am actually wondering how that evolves over time. Now, again, the other thing is to remember is AI is not the solution for everything. You still have to be able to explain what you're looking for, what you're trying to do. It can't take today, it can't take something like a story and just say, let me go build it for you. Though over time, it probably will. Over time, it definitely will be able to do that. So it's also I don't think this is a problem I need to solve today. This is a problem I will have to solve over time. And I think maybe that's the other side of it is sometimes we go through this phase of how with new technology, what's the risk versus the reward that you're trying to work through? So the way I've at least approached this is look, yeah, there is a risk that I will have some pieces of code that people don't fully understand. But there's probably going to be a vast majority of other code, like boilerplate code, that people will understand. So how much is because I don't want to lead through fear. I have to lead through what the future I wanted to create. And so then you start putting checks and balances. So we'll ask people hey, you did code reviews. Did you understand the code review? Did you understand this code? And if that becomes a problem, we'll revisit and address it. But it is looking at it from a lens of okay, how do I lead from the front to embrace technology versus be afraid of it?
Yeah, and I'm sure that will change as technology evolves, right? I'm sure that just as we're afraid that some people don't understand what the AI generated code does, is it a matter of how many layers of abstraction you have on top of that, right? And how comfortable are we with the tooling? So just because I saw a few heads nodding while you were saying, Ryan and Sakshi, do you also do human code reviews within your organizations?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And I just wanted to add, we did try an AI code review tool, not exclusively, but we still had human code reviews. We tried an AI code review tool. We found it to be of limited use compared to a static analysis tool like SonarQube. We actually found that to be much more valuable still than an AI code review tool. So for us, a combination of a static analysis tool plus a manual code review is still really necessary.
Yeah. I want to grab onto something that Anand mentioned. You spoke a little bit about concerns around the data that is used to produce the models, right? Data privacy and security, those are big concerns. How do you ensure that your team's workflows stay secure while leveraging those tools?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a big problem. We think a lot about this. Data privacy is actually at the forefront of all of it. But the other side of this is like, I think people are still using AI behind the scenes, right? Whether you and I like it or not. So I think the question for us we looked at is like, okay, we need to set up a process in place in the first place. So we set up company policy, company governance associated with that. And we actually reached out to these companies to sort of establish a partnership saying is like, look, we're going to use your APIs and in exchange, you're not going to train on our data and like, let's work through this. And now we're actually encouraging everyone to use our platform so that I have rules on this place. I can work through and say like, this is how this data is being secure. Because I would argue that if you were to go talk to most companies out there, there are engineers who are using all of these tools out. I mean, before that, you were doing a Google search. When I was an engineer, I would do search on Google. And I'm like, I have no freaking clue what I'm doing on this part. And next thing you know, someone's posting on Stack Overflow. So those things did exist. And I think that I think that's going to continue to happen regardless. So it's more like, how do you establish processes and how do you not go upstream on it, but rather enable that in the right ways? There are still rules internally, right? Like we work in healthcare, so there's a lot of healthcare information, healthcare data, so that we treat very differently. But as an engineer who's coding stuff, like that's a different threshold versus dealing with PHI, which is different from PII, which is different from. So we have different tiers and thresholds here as well. So we'll work through that. And then we've also built more platform and guardrails around it. But this is a very real, serious concern. So I agree completely on that.
Okay. So I want to hear Sakshi's opinion on that because she mentioned that her organization was particularly conservative around the use of AI. Would love to know how you think about security and data privacy.
I think we are still trying to, on a pilot, figure out what kind of security holes or privacy issues it might open us up to. So we are in that discovery stage. We're going to continue to use this conservative strategy, see how things work for us in the next few weeks, in the next few months, and then probably open up usage more officially of Copilot and other AI tools internally. One other use case helpful for AI is incident ops. If you have an intelligent AI tool that helps you analyze incidents, analyze patterns across incidents, and help you kind of surface those issues is something that's super beneficial. That is another area that we've been exploring more recently. There are like AI tools in the market right now, especially catered to intelligent incident ops. So I think that adoption of that would be easier in the organization. And I feel like that sort of poses lesser security and privacy risks because we are not opening up our source code or necessarily our data sets to those tools.
Understood. Yeah. That's how you're initiating the adoption of the tools without granting access to the source code. Makes a ton of sense. And Ryan, before we were chatting about bias in AI, and I think you had an interesting approach to identifying and addressing ethical concerns in the algorithms. And, I would love for you to share some of your thoughts with our listeners.
Yeah, I think my company has probably been the least conservative of the group that's gathered here in terms of just allowing our engineers to, and it's like you said, and not like people are going to use these tools anyway, so we're kind of just open to that. But we have done reviews of, and largely driven by our customers as we build our own AI tooling based on these platforms. We've done our own reviews of their privacy policies as well. But in terms of ethics and bias in AI, I think my thoughts are maybe more broad than just engineering. As an engineering manager, I have to trust that the model has been trained on open source code and that they've vetted the licensing requirements of this code that they're training on. It would obviously be a problem if these models were trained on closed source code somehow. I've seen that Microsoft recently released, they have something called their Copilot copyright commitment, and they've committed to defend customers against copyright infringement claims. I found that interesting. But on a bigger picture, like as a person just with an interest in art, this is one of my major concerns with generative AI is that if the power of AI is concentrated in the hands of just a few large companies that have the resources and the budgets that are required to train these massive language models, and they're exploiting copyrighted content without compensating artists and people who've actually generated the content, I think that's a major problem. It almost becomes like a snake eating its own tail, because as AI content becomes more prevalent in the world, that's the type of content that will continue to be ingested by these AI models. And so it becomes kind of this circular thing where the models are ingesting content that they've created. And is that going to lead to quality problems? In terms of bias, I think we just have to take great care as a society to make sure that generative AI can't be used to harm vulnerable people, and that the algorithms that we're putting in place aren't used to harm vulnerable populations. There's a statement that was attributed to an IBM engineer from the 1970s And he said, a computer can never be held accountable. Therefore, a computer must never make a management decision. Based on the trajectory of where everything's at, that might already be a losing battle. We might have already lost that battle. I think computers are making decisions every day. I think we're all kind of in uncharted territory here.
That's a very, very interesting take on the subject. It seems really that we have three organizations here that are in different levels of adoption and different levels of aggressiveness and conservativeness towards that adoption, but you all had to start somewhere, right? And I would love to hear from you about that initial introduction of AI tools to the teams. Maybe it was a reaction to the fact that they were already using it. Maybe it was intentional, but how did you train people? How did you direct or coach people to actually use them well? And how do you keep that momentum going for adoption? Maybe you start, Ryan.
Sure. I kind of sense that I haven't done a good enough job with this just because, like you said, people started using these tools before I even really had a chance to catch up with it. But that's definitely going to be a much bigger area of focus for me this year, is not getting caught up in the day-to-day, but kind of keeping an eye on the more strategic picture. Like I said earlier, we've never been prescriptive about what tools people use. When we first started, to answer your question, we did offer a pilot of Cursor to all of our engineers in order to gather data. We had about 7 of our engineers take us up on that offer. 100% of those engineers continued using it after the pilot, and we conducted a survey and they all said that they would recommend it to their teammates. There were some concerns. We asked them for what their biggest concerns were. They flagged accuracy as a big concern. Only 25% of these completions are accepted, which I don't know how that compares to other companies. So that might be high, that might be low. The other thing they flagged was handling of edge cases, which I think we talked about earlier. It can't necessarily help us to debug random customer edge cases that we might not otherwise have thought of. But we started with a pilot, and I think that's what we're going to continue to do is as we find new tools that might be even more advanced, we'll continue to offer pilots to our engineers and see what they think.
How about you, Anant, when you were in the early stages of adoption, what tools and what tactics did you use?
Yeah, so there's a few different pieces to it. Like one is, I think AI and machine learning has been a core part to the business. Like I think our company, if you were to describe what is included health, I would say it's personalized all-in-one healthcare. And personalization requires you to have an extensive amount of machine learning, lots of data. So we process like millions of, there's a lot of data that we work with, and therefore AI or machine learning has been a core part of it. So AI has not been anything new. Like I think it's just the newer hype because of, I would argue, actually ChatGPT or OpenAI led that in a very meaningful way. But machine learning and AI has been a core part of it. The second thing that I would say is I think we had some leaders at the company who actually who were like the champions. Folks that come to mind for me is Jyotika Sangvi, Rick Wolf, Eric Carlson, and amongst many, what you had is a few folks in the organization who are going to be big champions. And they led from the front and they were like, let's go try it out. Let's go do this. And the third is I think it ties in with our business success and long-term strategy as well. So it's one of those where it's I think it shows up whether it's from our leadership and exec team of how do we do this, but also from the product experience that I or any of us want to build. I think about healthcare. One of the challenges with healthcare is that there's a lot of disparate data, and technology and machine learning can do a phenomenal job at helping you through this. So we had a lot of momentum in that regard. I think for us, whether it's internally or not. Now, adoption of these tools, training of these tools is always it's some work because it changes the way you develop through it. And so we had other folks internally in few engineers. Steve Rubel is another individual that comes to mind who sort of championed this within the organization as hey, let's go try it out. Let's go do it. Other challenge I think internally that's always the case is how much time do you invest in sort of these venture bets versus building core product, because these experiments you're going to go through. And so that space, if I were to go back in time, I wish I had created even more space to go try it. Oh, and a couple other folks, sorry, I made the mistake of naming people. And so now all of a sudden, I'm if I don't mention them, but Will Horton internally is also an amazing engineer who really was let me go enable that. One of the things we do is we do a hackathon every 6 months internally. And so that also created that momentum for us to be able to say, so one of our products, which we call Chat IH, Will Horton presented that. And next thing you know, 3/4 of our company is using this now internally because it's so valuable for us. So it's various different things. To answer your question, I think AI and ML has been a core part of the business. So we've had sort of expertise capabilities. Second is we had a few sets of champions who led from the front. And the third is it actually makes the product and all of those things better. So we had alignment, interest, and sort of momentum internally to push it forward as well.
That's awesome. Sakshi, I'm very interested in hearing from you because you seem to be going through this right now.
Yeah. So as I think I'm getting a lot of great ideas here on how to kind of measure effectiveness of these AI tools as we kind of continue to adopt them. I think the way they came about to be is a lot of the engineers internally were probably using free versions that are available online. And a lot of these requests came from the engineering team that we need to start using these AI tools. They can be pretty effective. Let's run some security analysis on it. And this independent event that happened where we were doing a security review for another tool. It's not an AI tool that we were using. And turns out in their privacy policy, they had mentioned if you use a free version, then they have complete access to your data and they can use it in whatever way they would want to use that data. And that's obviously like this legalese that really needs a lot of attention and proper security sort of view on those policies. With that independent event happening and a lot of ask from the internal engineering teams on wanting to analyze and use these data sets, these tools is how we kind of started looking into Copilot and bunch of other tools that we're still analyzing.
I think you mentioned how to measure the effectiveness of these tools. And it's interesting because normally the adoption of a new tool for it to be sustainable in the long term would require us to show ROI. I guess that a lot of companies are going through the opposite problem. CEOs are pushing for this, hey, let's use this AI thing without even knowing if it generates value or not. But at some point, people will need to measure if this is generating ROI or not. It can be tricky to measure. Have you guys been faced with this challenge? Are you measuring productivity gains in an objective way? In any way, are you reporting those gains to your teams or execs? And what metrics do you guys use? Maybe we start with Ryan.
As of now, we're not reporting out AI specific metrics, but I think we will begin doing so soon. As I talked about earlier, we do track our engineer uptake percentage, at least of the tools that we prescribe. I think this year I'd like to expand it to just tracking AI tool usage more generally. We also track the tab completion usage, as I talked about earlier, in the tab acceptance rate. In terms of correlating these with other productivity metrics, that's not something that we have reported out. And even internally, I would say that I have not really wrapped my head around what that looks like yet. I think this year there will be a concerted effort to correlate the usage of AI tools with productivity metrics to see what kind of gains, hopefully gains, we're seeing in that area.
And Anant, I think you kind of touched on this when you mentioned mobile before, right? You said that, look, this feels a little bit like mobile. You can't really measure it, but it feels like the future. I would love to hear you expand on that.
Yeah, for sure. So the thing is, like, AI is a technology, right? Like, I don't measure the productivity benefit of using an IDE. I don't go in and say, what's the productivity benefit of giving people an extra large monitor versus not, right? But the thing is, that does not mean I don't care about developer productivity and whatnot. So what we're using is we're looking at it more sort of comprehensively in terms of engineering productivity as a whole. We use a tool called GetDX, which has been really helpful for us to do this. But like, we look at DORA metrics, we look at how is code commits and things like that. We also do a developer survey, like, how is your happiness? What are the things? What are your pain points? And we look at productivity in the aggregate. And then there's a team's charter, and their job is to improve productivity. Like, and basically, and it's not productivity like work harder. It's like, how much fun are you having as an engineer? Like, why should we be fighting with our tools and whatnot? AI enables and improves that. And like, if it's not achieving the team's goals, that's when we will engage in that conversation. But to go pick on one individual tool and say, like, is this working perfectly for you or not? Like, I think we're simplifying this way too much, or it's too reductive as a problem. I think a more interesting problem would be to say is like, look, as an engineering leader, or organizational leader, or manager, or what have you, how is the impact that you are creating for your organization? How is that increasing? And I think for many of us, like, we don't want engineering to just be a coin operated machine. Like, give me 10 engineers, I'll give you that. So the way I look at this is I have a budget. Well, how much of my budget do I want to allocate towards hiring engineers? How much of my budget do I want to allocate towards vendor spend or tool spend? And I am leveraging, again, like, sort of the data that we have in terms of improving productivity, how is these things going, and sort of making a judgment call. Longer term, if I suck at that judgment call, I should be fired and we should hire someone else. And that's okay, right? Like, that's not that's kind of the sort of the portfolio approach, if you will. And finally, I think it's just too early right now to be able to say AI will replace a mid-level engineer or something like that. But I think that maybe that's actually an interesting proposition. what I think is like, I think AI should over time make it so that kind of like, I think, Lucas, what you mentioned is a very valid point, is like the layers of abstraction might change. It may take you a lot less time to be able to ship a iOS screen and things like that. I think those things will come up. And I think maybe finally, I do see anecdotal evidence of it, right? Like you can talk to engineers here and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I was able to do this way faster without it. Or I was able to do it way faster with this because it enabled me to do this. And the other thing is you can also look at it as like, how upset would you be if this tool went away? So that's the other way to measure product market fit. Rahul Vora wrote a fantastic post on this topic about it. Like, how upset would you be if you lost this project? And he's the CEO of Superhuman. But that's the other way to look at this would be is like, if you got rid of this, how upset would the people be internally? And that's another way to measure the value that you're creating here.
Yeah, that's a good take. That's a really good take on that. I want to move us into the last part of our webinar. I want to talk about the future of engineering with AI, because we're talking about adoption and the state of technology right now. Let's get our crystal balls out of our backpacks and try to think about the future. We hear a lot of stuff about AI replacing jobs, but it seems to be a consensus around this table that it's more about enhancing what engineers can actually do. Where do you think it's heading? If you agree, let me know if you agree with that. And I'll start with you, Anant. Is it really enhancing what engineers can do? Is it a threat? Is it going to replace jobs? And where do you see this going?
Yeah, I mean, one part is like, depends on what time horizon. Like there is a part of me that wonders, am I going to live in the Matrix or am I going to live in the world of the Terminator? Like, I think with advances in tech, like, is that where we're headed or something? So let me ignore the super crazy future world. I think in the short term, it's definitely going to be an enhancing thing. Now, I think it is going to change the jobs we do, right? Like I think about how technology has played a part. Like there was a time where you had bank tellers, like that's how you got money out. There was a time when you wanted to call someone, you had a phone operator. You don't have those roles anymore. They have been replaced by technology. And I think that's going to happen. But I think it's going to lead to different jobs and different roles. And some of those roles we can't even think of today that will come through. I think that's the purpose of technology, is to sort of automate and make things life easier for us so we can do different and other things. Back in the day, you'd have to go get water for your home, and now you have running water in your home. That means with that free time, you're probably doing something else. Now, there's a other like more philosophical question you can go down of is like, what do we do with all our free time? Are we just working more and harder? And like, I think I was reading an article, which was, despite advances in technology, humans are still spending the same amount of time doing household work. It just is different work than they did in the 1950s. And since then, there's so many other things that have changed. And so that part, I actually do wonder, like, what should life be like? Like, should we be working 40 hours a week or not? My hope is no, but I don't know. Like, those are some of the other philosophical questions I don't have great answers for.
Yeah. It's interesting because, Mark Benioff said recently that, Salesforce is not going to hire an engineer in 2025. He's kind of, plugging his own agent product there a bit. But if you say that engineers are being more productive because of AI, but you're thinking that because of that, you're not going to hire more engineers, what you're basically saying is that you're okay moving at the same speed that you are right now, and you don't want to move any faster, right? Which is kind of you can then have a philosophical discussion about what to do with the time. But as the CEO of a company, as somebody who wants to maximize shareholder value, it's just a conclusion that you cannot accept.
The only thing I would add to that's a very good point. But I also think that means that there's other companies that people can work on. Like, I think it'll increase the access to amazing talent everywhere. It's not going to be hoarded by these large companies. Now it's going to be available to all. And I think you can do way more. Like maybe instead of us building 10 apps every now you'll have 100 apps and then more choices and more products. And so I'm looking at this more from a lens of like, oh, this could be really good. I do think there's going to be risks associated with this as well.
Sakshi, would love to ask you the same question. Where do you see this heading in the long term?
I don't see this wiping out software engineering jobs altogether. I think they might change a little bit in the sense I think they might focus more on high-level thinking, system design, and like those areas a bit more. I see AI helping with productivity, AI sort of augmenting existing development processes. But yeah, for me, it's hard to imagine a future where everything is fully automated, everything's working end-to-end seamlessly, and there is no human intervention needed in each of those steps. I'm not as bullish, I guess, on the whole AI world yet. Maybe once we see a mid-level software engineer being actually replaced by AI is when I'll probably get on that bandwagon. But for now, again, I think I have a bit more conservative approach on this whole thing.
All right. Ryan, your take.
Yeah, I think everyone's right that I think that the people who have a vested interest in getting us to use AI are making very grandiose predictions about the things that it can do now and the things that it's going to do in the future. So I think I would agree that I don't necessarily see it replacing an engineer anytime soon. I think I would view it as almost more of a pair programmer. And I think as an engineering leader, it's really key that we kind of get our own hands-on experience with these tools. So I've been using, there's a new IDE called, I think it's called Windsurf. And I've been kind of just using it for like personal projects, one-off scripts that I need to write, things like that. And what's interesting about it is it uses Copilot, but it also uses agentic AI. So it has access to the entire code base. And the way it works is it can essentially mimic a human engineer because it can analyze the entire project. It can open files, it can create new files. You can even have it create an entire project from scratch, write all the boilerplate code for you. And when I used this, I was actually pretty amazed by it. But that said, it's not the be all end all. You still have to hold its hand. It still makes plenty of mistakes. And you really have to drive the software. So I think, at least for the foreseeable future, there will need to be an engineer, a real human engineer to, at the very least, drive these tools and to make them work really well. The way I see it is it's really almost like an always on connected pair programmer that you can chat with and have help you throughout the programming process.
Yeah, and I want to use that as a segue for my next question, because what I think that entails is that the role of the software engineer is going to change. It's going to evolve. What do you think the job of a software engineer will look like in, say, 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so I think in the short term, we'll see, like, as I said earlier, I think these tools will kind of evolve into a type of pair programmer. And like I said, they can be pretty frustrating to use because they at the moment, they lack the full context of what you're trying to do. And so we need to see larger context windows increase in size so that they become smarter. And yeah, within the next 5 to 10 years, I still think we will see these tools primarily be a very smart pair programmer that will work alongside a human engineer. That's my view on it.
And Sakshi, on that, what do you think that the role of an engineer will look like in 5 to 10 years? First, what's your view on that? And two, do you think there should be more guardrails and regulations around AI development? And if so, what would you prioritize?
Yeah, so I think in terms of role of software engineer in a few years from now, I'm kind of with Ryan on that one. I think it'll probably mature a little bit into some more high-level thinking, system design kind of problem sets, rather than a lot of writing day-to-day code. And I see AI tools helping with that code generation, but I don't see AI tools completely replacing software engineering jobs in any which way. I think software engineering would still be very relevant. It just would be a bit more about high-level thinking and system design at that point. In terms of guardrails, I think there's a lot of interesting things there. For instance, the bias data sets, that's kind of been a debate in the industry. A lot of the training sets being used to train these models, they are biased. They're a reflection of the society as such, right? So how do you kind of program, or how do you train these LLMs to take these biases into consideration? I feel like that is something I would really like to be prioritized in terms of guardrails as we think about AI a bit more.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Guys, we're running up against the end of our webinar, so I want to wrap up with one question, and I want to hear each of your opinions about the elephant in the room. It's about AI's impact on the job market. We're not talking about replacing engineers, but there is definitely going to be a shift in terms of the role of the engineer, what's the expected job to be done, but also in how you guys, engineering leaders, think about the structure of your teams. What kind of skills do you look for? What kind of seniority do you skew towards? And are you seeing shifts in that direction already? Are you prioritizing certain skill sets over others? Are you changing your own interview process to make sure that the team makeup is actually compatible with the tooling that you have at your disposal? And I'll start with Anant.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different pieces here. Personally, I actually see a lot of excitement for the future on this front. Like, I again think about, like, there was a world in which, if you go back, right, like computers first they came out, there's only certain sets of things you could do, but it was very much like keyboard, mouse, what have you. Mobile came in, it increased the surface area for what you could build. You imagine an AI world, AI could also be another surface area that which you build products for. So you may build products on web, products on mobile, and products on AI. And basically you have a world like if you go down the path of agents and things like that, like you can envision a world you're like, look, I'm building a product. My product actually is experienced through an AI agent. And that's just a whole nother thing. And so in many ways, actually, I would say I look at this as the expansion of the space rather than a reduction of what exists. And so from that angle, I think the demand for people who are technologists who can use technology to build products, it does not decrease, actually increases. The second part of this is I think in the short term, it's been interesting to observe. I think a lot of the discourse ends up happening is, hey, does this mean the new college grad or the mid-level grad, are they the people earlier in their career going to be more disproportionately impacted? Actually, in the short term, maybe, but I think that's more reflective of the macro trends that are going in market. I think what's going to be tricky is the speed at which the technology is changing is going to impact folks who are not keeping up with it. So I think if you're in college, it's an amazing opportunity to go try out different technologies. Like I'm pretty sure there's students out there who are leveraging OpenAI and like building their own chatbot systems and things like that. Now imagine if you don't have that flexibility, you don't have that much time, you may not be as experienced at it. So I think in the next, and this sort of happened with mobile, right? Like if you were to look at when mobile first came about, all of a sudden you're trying to hire amazing mobile engineers. You had people who were either more entrepreneurial or people who were willing to take that on as a bet. That's what accelerated them. So I think that's going to be the makeup. Internally, I think that doesn't change. What we're still looking for is smart, capable engineers who understand systems and products and things like that. I think the makeup is going to be much more on like, can you build more product experiences? I think that's going to be that shift. But generally speaking, I just see the world expanding. So I don't think that will dramatically change. And most of those things will be more of a function of macro trends rather than technology trends in this regard.
Understood. Ryan, do you agree with that? What's your take on the impact of AI on the structure of teams and the job market?
Yeah, I do generally agree with that. I think that AI, as it continues to evolve, the role of engineers will evolve. And as AI democratizes software development and makes it easier for people with less technical knowledge to create simpler, one-off, bespoke applications to do things, that engineers are going to be focused maybe more on building the foundational tools and infrastructure that makes those types of applications possible. So like you said, there's an expanding opportunity there for people who can do that. One of my big concerns with this technology for companies is that compute is going to be a massive factor in how AI scales within companies. If we're not careful, AI could end up being like another cost center, the same way cloud computing is a cost center, where a few big players dominate. We're already seeing that. And then everyone else is stuck paying premium prices. I worry that we're kind of going down the same road that we went with cloud computing, where prices become overinflated and then power is concentrated amongst people who can afford to pay for these things. So I wonder if it means that we should lean more heavily toward engineers having beefier local machines that they can work on in order to run local language models without having to rely on the cloud. In terms of hiring, one of the questions that we always ask candidates is, what's a technology that's exciting to you right now? And it's really interesting because the answer a few years ago was always blockchain and crypto. And then around 2 years ago, that started shifting to AI. So I think companies that are working in the AI space and have a proven track record of innovation in the AI space are the ones that are going to be able to attract more of that top talent. So I think it's going to have an impact on hiring in that sense too. And it's going to give more opportunity to companies that are already innovating in that AI space.
Great. And Sakshi, you mentioned a couple of times that you believe that we will continue to need humans in the picture, but do you think that that will impact the structure of the teams and the way you make hiring decisions?
I think maybe eventually, as we start relying on AI tools a bit more for like code development, then I think the role of software engineers evolves to being a bit more like high-level thinker, system design, kind of, experts on the team. I think then it might change the makeup of the teams, but I still think that future is a little far away. I don't foresee that happening in the next year or two at least. And even with our current hiring, we still focus on people who are technology experts, who can write good code, who are fast learners, who can adapt to newer technologies quickly. And I think we still emphasize on all of those skill sets at the moment as we hire.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I want to thank Ryan Cooley, Director of Engineering at ProcessMaker. I want to thank Sakshi Garg, Head of Engineering at Hydrolix, and Anant Gupta, SVP of Engineering and Data Science at Included Health. for joining us here on this webinar around From Hype to Reality, leveraging AI to boost engineering productivity. Thanks everyone who joined the webinar as well. Everyone will get an email with a recording shortly. Thanks everyone. Hope to see you soon.